Hello, everyone, and welcome to PCR's November Virtual Transition Times. My name is Melissa Wyman, and I am PCR's Respite Care and Community Engagement Director. Paula? I will be your moderator this evening, so please feel free to send any questions or comments in the chat box below. We are delighted to offer this presentation with American Sign Language simultaneous interpretation. We will also be offering this presentation with Spanish simultaneous interpretation. To access the channel in Spanish, click Interpretation in the meeting controls and select the Spanish channel. Participants in a language channel will hear the translated audio and also the original audio at a lower volume. To hear the interpreted language only, click Mute Original Audio. The English and Spanish language versions will be archived on the PCR website Transition Times page. Please share the recording and upcoming Transition Times programs with your friends and others in the community. It is very important to continue to spread the word about Transition Times so we can continue to better serve our community. I want to give a special thanks to Heidi De Paula, PCR volunteer, and Rita Scheinberg, MC Transitions, for all their help with Transition Times and the dedication to our families and their loved ones. Just some Zoom tip reminders. We are using the webinar platform. We will wait for questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to submit any of your questions in the chat box below. Click Show Captions to see the captions for the webinar. You must select the speaking language you would like to show. We are fortunate tonight to have as our presenter Michael Dalto from High Note Consulting, LLC. Michael?
Thank you very much, Melissa. I have a grown son, and if you ever meet him, please promise that you won't tell him that I told this story in public, because the incident occurred when he was toilet training. But he had been practicing this new skill for a number of weeks, and we thought that he was ready to go out on sort of a test run. So he got dressed in his big boy underpants, no diaper, and I strapped him into his car seat and drove about 15 minutes. And every single minute I turned around and asked him, "Do you have to go?" He kept shaking his head no. I got to our destination. I parked the car. I unstrapped him, lifted him out of his seat. And of course, you're all parents. You know what I discovered. He was soaking wet. And I said to him, I asked you every minute if you had to go. Why didn't you say something? He looked at me with these big innocent eyes and said, "But I wanted it to be a surprise." And that was the day that I learned that my son might have a future working for Social Security, because you usually get the information you need from them, but it's often just a little too late. So I hope you're getting this information in a timely way. We'll be talking this evening about supplemental security income, known as SSI for short, the medical assistance benefit that comes along with it, which is also known as Medicaid, and lots of information about who's eligible, how to apply, etc. And then we'll get into my favorite topic, which is what happens when a person gets SSI and then goes to work. There are a variety of safety nets that help protect benefits when a person works. And we're ready for the next slide, please. So who's eligible for supplemental security income? A person who either has a significant disability or who's at least 65 years old. Naturally, we'll be focused on people who get SSI based on disability this evening. You can be any age, although most people don't become eligible for SSI financially until adulthood, until they're 18. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. You have to be a US citizen or a legal alien who meets certain requirements. And because SSI is based on financial need, you have to have income and resources. Resources are assets below certain limits. Next slide, please. So how disabled does a person need to be? The definition of disability is somewhat different for adults than it is for children. For adults, the disability has to be considered severe. It has to have lasted or be expected to last at least 12 months, or it could be a terminal illness. And the disability has to prevent the person from doing substantial work. And substantial work is defined for people who are not blind currently as earnings of $1,470 a month or more in 2023. That amount will go up to $1,550 a month as of January 2024. Although in many cases, a person's earnings may be even higher and they could still qualify for SSI. This point may surprise you. Most people believe that if you're capable of working at all, let alone if you're already working, you will not be eligible for SSI. That is a myth, completely false. You can be capable of working. You can even be working when you apply and still be found eligible for SSI benefits. Your disability has to limit your ability to work, but not prevent you from working completely. Now, the definition of blindness, which is important because Social Security treats blindness differently from any other disability. There are some more beneficial rules. Their definition of blindness is the vision in the better eye with correction, with glasses, is no better than 20/200, or the field of vision is no greater than 20 degrees. If your family member meets that definition of blindness and they get SSI, then they could actually be earning more than the substantial work amount when they apply and still qualify for SSI. Next slide, please. So we talked about the fact that there's a limit on income and a limit on resources or assets. What is the income limit? It depends on the type of income the person receives. Now, if the person has only so-called unearned income, such as Social Security payments, pensions, annuities, interest, dividends, etc., their income must usually be under $934 a month this year and under $963 a month in 2023. Now, if the person has no so-called unearned income and all of their income is earned, such as wages, self-employment, salaries, tips, royalties, etc., then their pre-tax earnings usually have to be under $1,913 a month in 2023 or under $1,971 a month in 2024 after their SSI payments have started. Remember, earnings have to be considered below the substantial level to initially qualify for SSI. But after SSI starts, a person's earnings can be significantly higher and they can still keep some SSI. Next slide, please. And what's the limit on resources or assets? Well, first of all, what are resources and how do they differ from income? I have a trainer friend who likes to say income is what you get and resources are what you got. So if a person receives money during a given calendar month, it counts as income that month and counts against the income limit. If they have any of that money left over that carries over into the first day of the next calendar month, that leftover amount becomes a resource, and it's subject to a resource limit. For unmarried individuals, that resource limit is only $2,000. So generally, you can't have more than $1,999 in a regular bank account and still qualify for SSI, which seems grossly unfair. Fortunately, there are ways to have more money, to save more money, and still be eligible for SSI. So types of resources that count against the limit would be cash, bank accounts, stocks, bonds, CDs, money markets, whole life insurance, the kind that has a cash value, retirement accounts, and real estate other than the home that you live in. But probably more importantly are the types of resources that are not counted against that limit. The home you live in, even if you own it free and clear with no mortgage and it's worth $1 million, as long as you live in it, it does not count against the resource limit. Neither does one motor vehicle. Life insurance, like term insurance that has no cash value, in other words, the person has to die in order for any money to be paid out, that doesn't count as a resource. Certain burial funds, special needs trusts, I don't really have time to go into them in detail, but they're special accounts set up to benefit a person with a disability, such as through a will, if a relative wants to leave money to a person getting SSI and not jeopardize their SSI eligibility. So a special needs trust is set up to provide money for the support of the person with a disability, but the money doesn't belong to them and they don't control it. Another person known as the trustee controls it. Unlimited amounts of money in a special needs trust will not count against the $2,000 resource limit for SSI. So it's a great way to deal with, for example, inheritances. The most recent type of resource that does not count against the limit is an ABLE account. You may have heard of these. These are special accounts that are owned by a person with a disability if their disability began before age 26. And they can save money either that they've contributed themselves or others have contributed, family, friends, agencies. And the first $100,000 saved in an ABLE account does not count against the $2,000 resource limit for SSI. So an ABLE account is a great way for a person with a disability to be able to save money, significant amounts, and still be eligible for SSI. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail about ABLE accounts. As I mentioned, person's disability had to begin before age 26 in order for them to be eligible, although they could be any age when the account is set up. They could be much older than 26 when they open the account, provided their disability began before age 26. That rule is going to improve in a couple of years. January 1st of 2026, a person will be eligible for an ABLE account if their disability began before age 46, which is a great benefit for people whose disabilities began a little bit later in life. As I mentioned, the first $100,000 in an ABLE account does not count against the $2,000 resource limit for SSI. There is a limit on how much can be deposited into a person's ABLE account. and that is currently $17,000 a year. That's going up to $18,000 a year in 2024. So contributions up to that amount are not subject to gift tax or income tax, which is very helpful. Next slide, please. So once money is in an ABLE account, it can be withdrawn to pay for a wide variety of expenses, including education, housing, transportation, employment training and support, assistive technology, health prevention and wellness. Next slide. Financial management, legal fees, even funeral and burial expenses. One I did not mention here, but I should have, is housing and food. Ordinary living expenses can be paid for with an ABLE account. Next slide. Now, when the federal law that enabled states to create ABLE account programs was passed, the original legislation enabled states to collect from an ABLE account that still had money in it when the account owner died, to be able to collect any remaining money up to the amount that had been spent on Medicaid expenses for that person after their ABLE account was open. Several years ago, fortunately, Maryland passed a law that said, we're not going to do that. If a person dies with money left in their ABLE account, then that money can be bequeathed to an heir. It does not does not revert to the state. Now, there are exceptions, people who receive long-term care services funded by Medicaid at or after age 55, when they die, the state can collect money from their estates, but that would apply to anyone, whether or not they had an ABLE account. So an ABLE account can be opened in any state that allows out-of-state residents to participate in their ABLE account, and there are dozens of them. However, there are compelling reasons why a person in Maryland would want to open their ABLE account in Maryland. One is that protection from the state collecting money remaining in the ABLE account when the account owner dies. And the other is a tax benefit. There's an income tax deduction on state income taxes, on Maryland income taxes, of up to $2,500 per year for contributions made to any Maryland ABLE account by a Maryland resident. Now, that's a tax deduction, not a tax credit. So the person who's making the contribution would not have their taxes reduced by $2,500 a year. It would probably be by several $100s, but that would not be available to a Maryland resident if their ABLE account were opened in a different state. ABLE accounts have a variety of investment options, from very safe, like a bank account, to more aggressive, involving stocks and bonds, but the account owner has the choice. And if you'd like more information about ABLE accounts generally, ablenrc.org, ABLE National Resource Center website is a great source of information. And Maryland, spelled out, marylandable.org, is the website for the Maryland ABLE account program. Next slide, please. So what is the maximum SSI benefit a person can receive? If they're not married and they live in Maryland, the highest amount is $914 a month. That will go up to $943 a month in January for the duration of 2024. Now, an adult who's getting SSI generally needs to be paying for their full cost of their own food and shelter in order to get up to the maximum SSI benefit. If they're not paying for their food and shelter, the most SSI they can get is reduced by 1/3. They can only get 2/3 of the full amount. So that's currently $609 and change this year and $628 and change in 2024. So it behooves a person who gets SSI to pay for their food and shelter so they can maximize the amount of SSI they can get. But a person who has other income besides SSI will usually get less than the maximum SSI amount. Next slide, please. So what happens if an adult is getting the reduced amount of SSI because they're not paying for their own food and shelter? There is a way to change that, to get that SSI amount increased. The individual needs to pay for their fair share of their own food and shelter costs. Now, there are actually three ways, well, a couple of ways to do this. One is if the individual who gets SSI is living with family and they're handling their finances as a family economic unit, they're sharing income and expenses, then the individual would have to pay their fair share of the household's food and shelter costs. How do you determine fair share? Well, if there are 3 people living in the home, you take the total food and shelter costs for the household, for the family, and divide it by 3 people. And the person would have to pay 1/3 of that amount. Now, for many of us, the fair share calculated that way of food and shelter would very likely be more than the maximum SSI benefit. If that's the case, there's a catch-22. If you need to pay more than the maximum SSI for your food and shelter, they will not give you the maximum SSI. They'll give you only the 2/3 amount, which sounds completely contrary to common sense. But I'm sorry, I only explain the rules, I don't make them. Next slide, please. Another alternative is to say that, to tell Social Security that your adult son or daughter who gets SSI is a separate economic unit. They're an adult, they're responsible for their own expenses, and they're essentially living like a boarder in your home. They're living in your home, they're paying for food and shelter. Now, if you present that situation to Social Security, then they'll ask, well, how much are you charging your son or your daughter? And if the amount that you charge them is the same amount that you would be charging an unrelated boarder for the same room and board, then your son or daughter can get the maximum SSI. And the form that you can use to document this is linked at the bottom of slide 12. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, how can a person have enough money to pay their fair share of food and shelter costs? Well, if they have enough money from their own income, their own SSI, and perhaps any other money they receive, then they can pay it completely out of their own pocket. But If they don't have enough, they could receive contributions from family or other people to help them pay for food and shelter if those contributions go into the person's ABLE account. The money that others contribute to the person's ABLE account can be used by the person to pay for food or shelter without without reducing their SSI. So this is a great way for family to be able to supplement the income of a family member who gets SSI, to help them pay for food and shelter without reducing their SSI benefit. Next slide, please. So SSI is a cash benefit. It comes along with a medical benefit known as medical assistance or Medicaid. Medicaid is the generic term for this benefit, which exists in every state, although it's somewhat different in every state. And in Maryland, it's also known as medical assistance. This is one of the rules for bureaucrats trying to confuse the public, give each benefit more than one name. That helps keep everyone off balance. So the benefit is generally known as Medicaid. In Maryland, it's also known as medical assistance. If a person gets any amount of SSI at all, even the minimum $1 a month, they're automatically and immediately eligible for Medicaid or medical assistance. You'd want to contact your local Department of Social Services and ask them how to get a Medicaid card. Medical assistance provides comprehensive coverage. It covers pretty much all medical services or supplies, equipment that you would expect health insurance to cover. It covers prescriptions with a very minimal copay, and the only copay for any service provided by medical assistance is for prescriptions. And it's only a little over $3 per prescription for name brand drugs, and only a little over $1 for each generic drug. The challenge with medical assistance can be finding healthcare providers who participate in it. In my experience, all hospitals and pharmacies participate, but beyond that, it can be more of a challenge to find healthcare providers who participate. Next slide, please. Now, Medicaid is very helpful as a standalone benefit if it's the individual's only health insurance, but it can also supplement other insurance. If a person has other insurance, the medical assistance will sometimes cover some expenses that the primary insurance does not. And sometimes it may be able to help with out-of-pocket costs like coinsurance deductibles and copays attached to the other insurance. Next slide. So that's basic eligibility for SSI. Now I'd like to talk about what happens if a person who gets SSI does paid work. So generally, when a person who gets SSI starts working for pay, their SSI will be reduced. But there are a variety of safety nets called work incentives that limit the impact of work on SSI and medical assistance. Before we get into this, I want to have you imagine, have you aware of the purpose of the SSI program. The purpose of the SSI program is to make sure that eligible people have at least a basic minimum amount of income to pay for food and shelter. So there is a logic to the SSI program. If you have no other income and you get only SSI, it would make sense that you should ordinarily get the maximum SSI benefit because you need every penny of it to pay for food and shelter. If, on the other hand, you have other income, then you would get less SSI because you wouldn't need quite as much. As your other income increased, your SSI would decrease. The reverse is also true. As other income goes down, SSI goes up. So you can think of the relationship between other income and SSI as being like a balance or a scale or a seesaw. As one side goes up, the other goes down. As one side goes down, the other goes up. Next slide, please. So the first safety net for people getting SSI who are doing paid work is that you're always better off financially. You always have more money if you're working for pay than if you're not when you receive SSI. How can that be? You might be wondering, I just explained that if you have other income, as it goes up, your SSI goes down. So how could you end up with any more money? And the answer is the earnings from work do not reduce your SSI dollar for dollar. Your SSI is reduced by less than half of your earnings from work. So let's say that you started out with the maximum SSI benefit, currently $914 a month. As your other income, your earnings from work, went up, your SSI would go down. But before your SSI was reduced to zero, you would be earning $1,913 a month. If you earned any less than that, you'd still be able to get at least a little bit of SSI. With earnings of $1,912 a month before taxes, a person would get $1 of SSI. Would they be better off working? Absolutely. Not working, their income would be only $914 a month. Working, in that example, their income would be $1,913 a month. $1,912 from wages, $1 from SSI. Even if they had to pay some taxes on their earnings from work, their net income would still be much more than $914 a month. So they'd have more money. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a particular illustration of why a person is better off working than not working if they get SSI. So this is an example using amounts for 2024. Marshawn starts out getting only SSI, the maximum for 2024, $943 a month. He starts working 15 hours a week and earns $15 an hour. Then he gets more hours, 25 hours a week, still earning the same hourly wage. And finally, he moves up to full-time, 40 hours a week, still making $15 an hour. Next slide, please. So this bar graph shows you what Marshawn's actual net income after taxes, I estimated how much his taxes would be, how much his net income would be in each of those scenarios. In the first column, you see he's getting only SSI, that's pictured in blue, and that would be $943. In the second column, when he's working 15 hours a week, the blue, the SSI portion is substantially reduced. You can see it's going down by almost half. But his wages, shown in orange, even after taxes, when added to his reduced SSI, make his net income much higher. It's getting close to $1,400 a month. In the third column, when he's working 25 hours a week, you can see the blue representing the SSI is greatly reduced. There's not a whole lot more than 100, 150 a month left. But when adding his wages after taxes, he's got well over $1,500 a month. So he's better off than he was working 15 hours a week. Finally, working full-time, 40 hours a week, his earnings from work would be high enough to reduce his SSI to zero. You don't see any more blue left, no SSI in that fourth column. But even without any SSI, his earnings from work, even after taxes, make his net income much higher than working 15 or 25 hours a week, over about $2,200 a month. So a person on SSI is always going to be better off working than not working. And the more they earn from work, the more net income they'll have. Next slide, please. There's a second safety net. It's actually a combination of safety nets. And that second safety net says there are some special rules a person on SSI can use to keep more SSI while working than they ordinarily would get. The first of those special rules is called the student earned income exclusion. And this is a work incentive, a safety net, only for students who are under age 22 and who are regularly attending school or a job training course. The student, if they're working for pay, are allowed to keep their full SSI payment, not have it reduced at all, if they earn up to a designated amount per year. That's $8,950 a year this year, and it's going up to $9,230 a year in 2024. So this is a great way for a student to try out paid work because they can earn a pretty substantial amount from work without having their SSI reduced at all. Next slide, please. And here's another bar graph example. In this example, a student starts out with only the maximum SSI and then starts working 10 hours a week, making $15 an hour. The student earned income exclusion lets her keep the full amount of her SSI while working, and she has her wages after taxes added on to that. Next slide, please. Another special rule is called impairment-related work expenses. This would be a great benefit for someone who is either not a student or who is not under age 22, could not use the student earned income exclusion, but who needs to pay for some disability-related expenses in order to work. Perhaps accessible transportation to and from the job, assistive technology, therapy, attendant care to prepare for work, a ramp to get in and out of the house, whatever it might be, medications, medical supplies, or services. All of those would be examples of impairment-related work expenses. When the person pays for those expenses, they are subtracted from their earned income. That means their earned income that's counted would go down. What happens when the countable portion of other income goes down? The SSI goes up. If the person meets Social Security's definition of blindness and they get SSI, I gave that definition a little earlier. The vision in your better eye with correction is no better than 20/200, or your field of vision is no greater than 20 degrees. Then there's a special rule only for blind people called blind work expenses that lets a person subtract any work-related expense, even if it has nothing to do with their disability, from their income to keep their SSI higher. Next slide, please. And finally, there's a work incentive called PASS, that stands for Plan to Achieve Self-Support, which is an agreement a person signs with Social Security to pay for certain expenses to reach a work goal. The work goal would generally be significant work hours in either employment or self-employment. And the PASS can help them pay for expenses needed to reach that work goal, whether it's training, education, tools, equipment, uniforms, transportation, even buying a car, computers, childcare, if that's needed to care for a child when the person using the PASS is working or going to school or training. It's a wide variety of expenses that it can cover. And once again, the expenses are subtracted from the earnings. That reduces the countable portion of the earnings, and the SSI goes up to help offset the expenses. Next slide, please. And here's my favorite work incentive. And before I go into it, Melissa, if we could go back to several slides prior, back to Marchand's bar graph that had the 4 bars in it, a little bit farther back. There it is. So when we went through this, you might have been thinking, well, I can see that Marchand's net income is going to be higher the more hours he works. But you might have been concerned about that 4th column. What happens when he's working full-time and his earnings are high enough to reduce his SSI to 0? What would happen to, for example, to his medical assistance? Could he keep it? The reason he got medical assistance in the first place was that he was receiving SSI payments. If the SSI payments stopped, would the medical assistance stop? Other thing you might have been wondering would be, what happens if Marchand stops working or his hours get cut and he's now earning little enough that he would qualify for SSI? Would he have to reapply and start all over to get it back? Thank you, Melissa. Now we can go back to the slide where we just were. Right there. I'm sorry, one before, slide 24. Great. This safety net, this work incentive, is exactly what someone in Marchand's position would need. This rule says, if your earnings from work, only earnings from work, go up high enough that reduces your SSI payments to 0, you still stay eligible for SSI. Well, what good is SSI without the SSI payments, you might wonder? There are 2 benefits. One is you'd keep the medical assistance, the Medicaid, and if anything happened to your earnings later, if you stopped working or your earnings just dropped low enough, you'd be able to get the SSI payments back just by calling Social Security. You don't have to reapply and wait. So this means a person really has nothing to lose working full time if they get SSI. Even if they're earning enough to reduce the SSI to zero, they still get to keep their medical assistance and go right back on SSI payments if anything happens to their earnings later. And there's no time limit to this rule. It can continue indefinitely. The rule is called 1619B. That's just the section of the Social Security Act that created the rule. But it's a huge, huge benefit. Next slide, please. So to be eligible for 1619B, a person's earnings usually have to stay below a certain amount. That's over $48,000 this year. And I'll tell you, for most people who get SSI, earning $48,000 is kind of a distant dream. But even many people who earn more than that amount, in many cases, can still be eligible for 1619B, particularly if they have high medical expenses covered by medical assistance. The person has to be otherwise eligible for SSI, have to keep their resources under the $2,000 limit. They have to continue to need Medicaid. If they just use it once a year, that demonstrates they need it. And there can't be other reasons that the SSI stopped, like no longer being disabled, having been medically improved, or winning the lottery, or getting a big pension, for example. But if the SSI is reduced to zero because of earnings from work, the person can be eligible for this 1619B rule. Next slide, please. Okay, actually, that wraps it up. I wanted to leave some time for questions.
Okay, that is great. Thank you so much, Michael. So we do have many questions. So let me go to the chat. All right, So are the rules for SSDI the same as SSI?
The rules for SSDI are very different from the rules for SSI. First of all, what is SSDI? SSDI stands for Social Security Disability Insurance. That's a different kind of cash benefit a person can get from Social Security if they have a disability, while SSI is based solely on financial need and disability. SSDI is based on disability and the individual, or in many cases, their parent, having worked and paid Social Security taxes on their earnings. So if a person gets SSDI and they go to work, the rules are different, but there are still safety nets, still work incentives that they can use to help protect benefits when they're working. SSDI and work is a different webinar that perhaps we'll be able to do again in the future. But I was focused primarily here on transition-aged youths, young adults, who generally receive SSI if they're getting any cash benefit from Social Security rather than SSDI, because they haven't had enough of a work history to qualify for SSDI, and their parents may not yet be retired disabled, or deceased, which needs to happen before a son or daughter can get benefits on their parents' record, can get SSDI on the parents' record. I did want to answer another question that hasn't been asked. I left you hanging on one point earlier when I said that most people don't qualify for SSI until they turn 18. And that's because children under 18 who live with one or two parents are generally not eligible because a portion of the parents' money, the parents' income and resources, are counted against the child when figuring out if they're eligible for SSI and how much they can get. And the parents' money generally prevents the child from getting any SSI. But if you have, say, a 17-year-old with a disability and they're getting ready to turn 18, one of their 18th birthday gifts can be applying for SSI benefits. Once they turn 18, it's only their own money that counts.
All right, thank you. Next question. What should someone do if their bank account has slightly more than $2,000 after an SSI or SSDI deposit? Would a day of too high of a balance put SSI in jeopardy?
This is a great question. For SSI purposes, Social Security is supposed to count only the amount of resources that a person has at midnight on the first day of the month. If that amount is less than $2,000, then they will meet the resource limit. If it's greater than $2,000, they won't be eligible for SSI that month. Now, if their SSI or other income is received after midnight on the first of the month, anytime for the rest of the calendar month, it counts as income, but not a resource until midnight on the first day of the next calendar month. So you can have a bank account that goes over $2,000 in the middle of the month, as long as it's under $2,000 before midnight on the first day of the next month, you're fine. Now, it's probably wise, just to avoid any confusion or accounting problems with Social Security, to keep your regular bank account balances comfortably below $2,000 at all times. And you can do that by having an ABLE account as well. So you can put enough money into the ABLE account to keep the balances in the bank account, in the bank accounts well below 2,000.
Okay, great. So another question is, can college students receive SSI if they are considered dependents for federal financial aid purposes?
Yes, dependents can be eligible for SSI. The problem is generally not whether the dependent will be eligible for SSI, but whether a person receiving SSI will continue to be a dependent for IRS tax purposes. I'm not an accountant, so please take this with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert on tax law, but my understanding of tax law is that you can claim a person as a dependent on your taxes only if you are paying for at least 50% of their living expenses. So if you've got a son or daughter who's receiving $914 a month of SSI, the maximum, and you want to claim them as a dependent on your taxes, you'd have to be sure that you are paying out of your income or assets at least $914 a month for their living expenses. In that case, then my understanding is you could claim them as a dependent.
Okay, great. So is 1619B coverage automatic, or is there some action one must take? At a
Great
minimum, I
question.
assume one must continue SSI wage reporting every month. Is this correct? And are there any other actions needed?
Okay. Um, the 1619B rule is supposed to happen automatically, but there are lots of things that are supposed to happen automatically with Social Security that don't necessarily because they're grossly underfunded and understaffed. So if a person's earnings are about to go up high enough to reduce their SSI to zero, it's a good idea to be proactive and to contact Social Security and make sure that they give the person 1619B status. And the person should always report their earnings to Social Security. If they get SSI, they should report them every month. And you can get help with learning how to report earnings, how to use work incentives, including 1619B, by getting free benefits counseling. There are two ways to do that. If your family member has a case open with DOORS, the Maryland Division of Rehabilitation Services, and they're getting SSI or SSDI, DOORS is required to provide benefits counseling to them. If the person does not have a case open with DOORS, they can still get free benefits counseling if they live anywhere in Maryland and they get SSI or SSDI by calling 866-968-7, I'm sorry, 866-968-7842. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. That phone number is called the Ticket to Work Helpline. And if you call them and explain you're calling on behalf of, I'm sorry, I don't think that went out to everyone. Try it again.
I can copy and paste it for you, Michael.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Melissa. So if you explain that you're calling on behalf of someone who gets SSI or SSDI, and is working or actively seeking work, they will connect you with a free benefits counseling project.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, but it seems to be a common question. So can SSI payments go directly into an ABLE account?
I believe that can differ from one state to the next. That would be a question to ask the ABLE account program. And if you go to Maryland, spelled out, marylandable.org, they have contact information there. I believe, I know that generally SSI payments go directly into a regular bank account and then can be transferred into an ABLE account.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, Michael, for your wonderful presentation. Please join us on Wednesday, December 6th from 7 to 8 to learn more about mental health services. This webinar will be presented by Sean Latanzio, Program Manager, Child and Adolescent and Coordinator, Montgomery County Local Behavior Health Authority, and sign language interpretation and Spanish interpretation will be provided. Thank you and hope to see everyone in December. Thank you so much, Michael.